Well, after a very long dry spell, there's finally more Venezuelan news. Some of you may remember that earlier in this year, the Trump administration gave their endorsement to a rival government in Venezuela led by one Juan Guaido, and supposedly the president was told that, hey, if you endorse this guy, well, then magically he'll be made the new president of Venezuela. Maduro will have to flee to Russia or something, and you'll be declared a hero. The idea, I guess, was that everyone in the military hated Maduro for some reason, and if Trump merely gave them some cover by recognizing Guaido, well then the military would stage some kind of coup against Maduro. Now, I said at the time that this was a very foolhardy idea because Maduro, of course, was the protege and heir apparent to Hugo Chavez at the time of his death, and Chavez essentially gave Maduro his blessing. Now, Chavez himself was a former prominent Venezuelan military captain, I believe, and or maybe he was a colonel. I forget. Usually, and he tried to lead a coup back in the 90s, and always, if you notice, with coup leaders, it tends to be not a general, but a guy who's a little lower, like a captain or a colonel. And so the military had a very long history with Chavez. They liked Chavez very much, so to me, it just seemed like a very bad bet to think that the military was going to rise up against their hero Chavez's chosen successor. And of course, I was proven correct because the military did not rise up against Chavez, or against Maduro, rather. In fact, Guaido's coup attempt fell flat. He had, maybe like 20 guys LARPing. They were wearing Venezuelan military uniforms with like a blue armband on them. It was ridiculous and embarrassing, and the U.S. looked completely feckless because, frankly, it looks like they were played for fools. Guaido later was revealed wasn't too serious about the coup attempt either. Apparently, him and a bunch of his cronies were taking the money that was being raised on their behalf and just sort of spending it frivolously on very expensive clothes and, sort of living high on the hog in Bogota. And apparently, from what we heard at the time, Trump was pretty miffed with Bolton, who had sold Trump on the idea and essentially said, hey, Don, this is going to be easy. You're not going to have to get your hands dirty. All you have to do is lend your voice, and you're going to have this great victory in Venezuela, and you'll look really cool for it. And Trump fell for Bolton's lie. Because, unless it was stupidity, I guess Bolton can just be that stupid, but I don't think Bolton's an idiot. So let's call it a lie. Trump fell for it, and Trump was mad at Bolton. Because he made him do something stupid, and Trump looked stupid for it. So I thought Trump was going to just try and forget about Venezuela, and that's how it seems things have been. Trump hasn't really mentioned them much. The government stopped putting out these, plans about how, this is when Maduro becomes president of Venezuela, here's all this money we're going to give them. Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross were out there before talking about how great the Venezuelan economy will be post-coup. And all that seemed to stop after, Trump decided that it was really a fool's errand, much like, say the war in Afghanistan, which Trump still hasn't ended. But that brings us to today. And today, about 18 hours ago, there's news that Trump is considering instituting some sort of a naval blockade in Venezuela and trying to force Maduro out that way. He thought that perhaps, since Maduro is such a bad guy, then we have to blockade his country so that he is forced to leave. The rationale, of course, being that if Trump, blocks all of the shipping in and out of Venezuela and the people begin to starve, well, then they will somehow rise up against Maduro and overthrow him and replace him with someone who the U.S. likes. I don't really know how that works because, if the U.S. institutes a blockade, sure, they might be able to get rid of Maduro, if they create enough chaos, if the whole country collapses, sure, Maduro won't have any power, but the next guy in line is probably not going to be someone who likes the U.S. It's probably just someone who's very mad at the U.S. for blockading their country and, starving them out, because conditions in Venezuela right now are not great. People are not, prosperous and happy and healthy. So if you, put a blockade on top of that, the whole country is going to come apart. I think that a violent civil war, perhaps on the level of that of Syria, is more likely to result from this naval blockade than, just somebody like Juan Guaido or some other U.S. friendly being put into power. And a civil war, of course, would certainly be the worst case scenario, far worse than having, just some guy in Venezuela who the U.S. doesn't like, who can just sort of taunt the U.S. and give, speeches at the UN where he says mean words about the president, like Hugo Chavez used to do about George Bush, saying that he smelled like sulfur or something. A much worse thing would be a Venezuelan civil war, because, of course, you would see probably a refugee crisis very similar to what's happened, in Europe as a result of the Syrian civil war. You have all these people who would be flooding out of Venezuela and into other countries, and then you'll have people flooding out of those countries to the north to try and escape, the destabilization that's been created by the Venezuelan refugees, and then you'll just have a wave of destabilization and refugees spreading all the way north up into the United States, and then suddenly we'll have untold thousands and thousands, perhaps millions of people showing up at the southern border, demanding to be let in. Something that I don't think would look particularly good on Trump's resume going into the 2020 election. And if, God forbid, from his perspective, he loses in 2020, well, then do you think that the Democrat who comes after Trump is going to turn away all those people at the border, or are they going to let them in? And are they going to make them citizens so that they can vote in the next election, as a thank you to that Democratic president for saving them? I mean, look at what's happened to Europe when they have a sudden influx of folks into their population who don't speak their language and who have come from a foreign land and from war-torn lands, and in many other cases, people who just wanted to get the hell out of wherever they were and move someplace where they could get a better job. You have this mix of refugees and economic migrants. In fact, this scenario was what I warned against when Trump was considering invading Venezuela before to try and overthrow Maduro. Creating this kind of chaos, on your own continent is very, very irresponsible. It's not like, say, invading Iraq, where when Bush invaded Iraq, sure, it destabilized the Middle East, but the Middle East is very far away. There are oceans between us. There's oceans and continents between us. All that destabilization in Iraq can only make its way back here, in the form of terror attacks, little one-off events, but you're not going to see waves of people and destabilization pouring over our borders. The same cannot be said if you destabilize a South American country like Venezuela. And so much like the proposed invasion plan of Venezuela and the invasion of Iraq, it would be very easy to overthrow the dictator you don't like. That's not the hard part. The hard part is putting the pieces back together once you've smashed the country into a million bits. The only two examples of nation building have been Japan and Germany, but there is no stomach in the U.S. right now for that kind of an occupation and nation-building project like was undergone in West Germany and in Japan. In fact, the U.S. still has thousands of troops in Germany and Japan. Yeah, so despite what one U.S. official who was cited by Bloomberg said that Trump is seriously considering this, I certainly hope that's not the case. And if he is seriously considering it, he needs to stop considering it, because there's no way in which this doesn't end up as a disaster. Either Maduro somehow weathers the blockade by some miracle of chance and isn't overthrown, and then Trump looks like an idiot for trying to run this big, expensive, and flashy blockade and not even accomplishing his goal, or Trump accomplishes his goal, which would be even worse, and the country devolves into a violent civil war, which spreads destabilization throughout South Central America and then ultimately into North America. With that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.